All right, guys, welcome everybody. This is Mark Woelfer, Senior Director from Visa's Dispute Processing Products Group. Today we're going to take you through, as Crystal mentioned, Visa Claims Resolution. We are approximately a month away from launching Visa Claims Resolution, which is about a 3-year initiative. It is quite possibly, it is the largest change we have made to our dispute processing capability in about 15 years. And so major changes coming. We hope that you will think the same as far as just how much better the ecosystem will be under the new Visa Claims Resolution Initiative. So, of course, today we're going to be talking about disputes, and that is, in today's world, the chargebacks and representments that are sent back and forth by issuers and acquirers to assist in aiding in those transactions by which the cardholder may have had a problem, there may have been fraud, there may have been a consumer issue, a variety of different reasons by which a dispute can be raised. So the purpose of today is to kind of take you through some of the high-level benefits of what is VCR doing specifically for merchants. And so I'll attempt to cover off on some of those changes. To Crystal's point, if you have questions, feel free to submit them. I'll be happy to answer them as we're going, as well as we'll probably have some time at the end to cover some questions as well. All right, so let's get started. Visa Claims Resolution, optimizing the dispute process for merchants. We're going to talk a little bit about what VCR is. Now, I imagine, given we're a month away, that a lot of you have already been in contact with your acquirers, and maybe you've attended some merchant seminars by which Visa Claims Resolution was covered. It shouldn't necessarily be a surprise to you at this stage, given we're a month away from implementation. So we'll cover off a little bit on what it is and why we're doing it. But we're going to spend most of our time talking about how does this help merchants, right? You know, I always say at Visa, the toughest part of my job is the fact that we Visa are sitting in the middle of two clients that have very conflicting requirements or requests, right? And so it's the hardest part is to put the changes in place that benefit everybody, right? And so VCR is definitely going to benefit all parties in the ecosystem, issuers, acquirers, and merchants alike. But we'll touch specifically on some of those things that we're doing specifically to help merchants out. Lastly, we'll touch on the timeline very quick. I already told you it's happening the week of April 15th of this year. 3 years in the making. You know, probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people we have spoke to about VCR across the globe. Many of us have seen the world as a result of this project, quite frankly, and so we are out socializing this and making sure that all clients are aware of what's coming. Okay, so let's get started. What is VCR? Well, first off, let's talk a little bit about this platform we have for dispute processing called Visa Resolve Online. Visa Resolve Online was introduced about 15 years ago. And what it was designed to do was to connect issuers and acquirers in an automated or semi-automated or at least electronic way through the internet, allow them to connect and interact when they have a dispute, right? And so that would mean the issuer could log in, raise an issue, the acquirer can respond on behalf of the merchant, and we would facilitate that all through this platform we call Visa Resolve Online. It's a great platform, quite frankly, and it does a lot of great things, but disputes are just very complex, right? And it's hard to simplify a process that really has a lot of intricacies. But VCR is going to attempt to the best of our ability to do that. So when I say VCR, or Visa Claims Resolution, what I'm talking about is an initiative, and it's an initiative to change or update the platform that we have called Visa Resolve Online. So many clients think that they're going to have to log into something new and have these whole user ID changes that the acquirers and issuers will have. That's not true at all. It's simply we're making changes to this Visa Resolve Online platform. So what are those changes? Well, there's a lot of them, but if I were to summarize kind of our key objectives, I would cover these 3 items here. One is we are trying to prevent and customize. And so what that means is prevent is specifically a merchant benefit. And what we're trying to do is say, there are disputes today that issuers are submitting that are not valid. And that causes a lot of strain for the acquirer and merchant communities, because when you get a dispute, the first thing you have to do is say, is this a valid dispute, right? And you have to spend time, money, and effort on making that determination. With VCR, you're not going to really have to do that, and I'll explain the details as to why. But we are going to be putting comprehensive edits in place to ensure that whatever the issuer is submitting has been vetted and verified based upon the transaction data that we have flowing through VisaNet, the Visa rules, and any data that the issuer enters about that transaction. Okay, so what this translates to, or what we hope this translates to, is a significant reduction in the volume of disputes that you get today. Now remember, disputes are rising at just overall, irrespective of any changes, are rising at the tune of 20 to 30% a year. But we are going to chunk off on that by these additional edits to the tune of about 14 to 20%. And so what that means is that we will be applying additional scrutiny to ensure that what an issuer is doing is correct and valid before it even gets to you. Second thing, automation. So we are introducing, where possible, automation into the process. So what that means is that, for example, fraud and authorization disputes, which represent about 60 to 80% of a given merchant, acquirer, or issuer's portfolio, we will be applying an initial liability assignment based off the rules that I just mentioned. So what that means is we will, when an issuer finds a transaction that they are wishing to pursue a dispute on, they will tell us, or they will ask us what category they're looking to pursue that dispute on, and then we will run a series of edits to ensure that that is a correct and valid transaction for that dispute category. We will also, for fraud and authorization, like I was mentioning, apply an initial liability assignment. That means that if it gets to the acquirer, for example, that means that Visa has vetted that transaction, and based off the transaction data and rules, the acquirer is deemed liable for that transaction. But it's an initial liability, and that's an important distinction. What that means is that you, the merchant, can still respond to that dispute with, say, compelling evidence or a couple of other reasons as well, the same reasons you have today, to basically provide context for that issuer as to why you do not feel that that transaction should be liability assigned to you. And so when I say initial liability, that doesn't mean it's a done deal. It means quite simply that the rules that we have, the Visa rules plus the transaction data, suggest that the acquirer and merchant are held liable for that transaction. Now, on the flip side, if the issuer is held liable for that transaction, then you won't even see that dispute. We will simply block it, say, issuer, you've tried to submit a dispute, however, you are liable for this. You are unable to proceed with that transaction. So automation is a big deal, and so allocation and collaboration are kind of the two workflows. You don't need to really know this. This is not a term that you're going to need, but it's how Visa refers to the two processes that we apply based upon the dispute category, whether it's fraud or authorization, which is allocation, or processing errors or consumer disputes, which is collaboration. The last piece, streamlining the existing workflow. We are going to, where possible, try and reduce the time frame associated with getting a dispute from start to finish. Now, this is part of the area where I said, oftentimes this requires a bit of a compromise on the issuing and acquiring side. So we are going to reduce the time frames associated with a dispute. That does mean that you may have less time than you have today to respond to a dispute. But we're also equalizing how long each party has. So right now in today's world, it's not really fair as far as how long each party has to respond. With VCR, it will be, and I'll touch on that here in just a second. Okay, so lots of things we're doing, but again, to just summarize, we want to block invalid disputes. We want to apply automation where we can, and we've done a whole host of streamlining activities, including taking our 22 chargeback reason codes and consolidating them into 4 dispute categories. Okay, so let's continue.
Hey, Mark, before we continue, we've actually received a couple of questions that came in. The first question is, what do you mean, can you further expand on not supported by transaction data?
Okay, so I'm going to have to infer what you're talking about, but I think where you're going, and if I don't answer your question, feel free to just submit a follow-up, but I think where you're going is, when I was mentioning fraud and authorization disputes, VisaNet transaction data, the data that flows through just by way of us processing a transaction, provides us all the necessary details to determine who's liable for that transaction. So things like, was the card swiped or not, or was the chip used or not? Those are all very, very important fields that are already flowing through VisaNet. So when I say we can apply an initial liability assignment for fraud and authorization, it's because we have all the data necessary and the rules are specific enough to tell us exactly what the liability assignment needs to be. Let's take authorization even, for example. It's either there was an authorization or there wasn't, right? And so if the issuer is attempting to pursue a dispute for no authorization and we have one, we're going to block them. It's very simple, right? There's no need for the acquirer or merchant to even get involved and waste their time in that transaction, because we will simply just block them from proceeding. Fraud's another one, right? The rules are pretty specific on card not present versus card present fraud. So simply using the transaction data we have enough information to provide an initial liability assignment. Now on the flip side though, processing errors and consumer disputes. If a consumer, and I use the example not necessarily applicable to the airline industry, but just by way of the one I always use, I always say, like, the cardholder, purchased a vacuum cleaner and it was faulty, right? It didn't work. Well, they might try and work with the merchant, but they may call the issuer and attempt to submit a dispute that way. That is called a consumer dispute. And with that, a consumer dispute, Visa is not going to have enough data to determine if that vacuum cleaner was faulty or not, right? Those data elements aren't flowing through VisaNet today. So with consumer and processing, and back to your question, we don't have, quote unquote, enough data to make an initial liability assignment there. We will simply facilitate the exchange between the issuer and acquirer to send that information back and forth.
Okay, and so they did provide a follow-up. It was a reference to the first point on the last slide. So if you could take a second and go back to slide 3.
Yeah, so I think I answered that just by way of when I say prevent and customize, what I mean is, do we have enough data to make an informed decision about that dispute, right? Today, our dispute process is almost like a funnel, right? If the issuer wants to submit something, we pretty much let it go through, and then the acquirer and merchant has to deal with the ramifications of, is this a valid dispute or not? With VCR, this new proposed change, we are going to have some pretty stringent rules in place to block issuers from submitting something that we deem is invalid based upon the rules or transaction data. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to keep going with the elaboration in the question box, and I'll try and get your question answered.
Okay.
What else are questions?
We received 2 additional ones. This question is that they heard since Visa implemented the automation that fraud disputes will only be issued as pre-arbitration, and is this correct?
Sure, and we're going to get to that, I think, on slide 12, but let me just comment on that. You're right. For fraud and authorization disputes, and in line with the objective here, number 3, to streamline the existing process, we got rid of a single phase of the dispute response, formerly known as a representment. So for fraud and authorization disputes, when we send a dispute across from the issuer to the acquirer, and we have deemed that the initial liability is assigned to the acquirer, that is a shift in liability just like it is today. But unlike how it is today, an acquirer and merchant's response is what we call a pre-arbitration. And pre-arbitration, unlike a representment, which is what you use today, a pre-arbitration is non-financial in nature, which means the acquirer and merchant will be doing a data share. There's no shift of liability back to the issuer in that case. And that is only for fraud and authorization disputes. With consumer and processing disputes, the liability will shift back. And I'm going to get to this. I have a slide on this in a second. So if I don't answer your question after slide number 12, let me know, but I should.
Okay. Another question is in response to the dispute growth. They've seen that the dispute growth is actually growing 20 to 30% per year. And is this trend projected to continue for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, and it likely is, right? We have seen pretty stable 20 to 30% growth over the past at least 3 or 4 years back that I've been looking. With VCR, we're going to try and stifle some of that, but it's just by way of fraudsters moving from the card present to card not present space, and the rise in digital goods purchases, which really kind of support or facilitate the ability for fraudsters to get involved in those types of transactions. So would that translate to the airline industry? Probably not, but you know, our industry as a whole, in particular when you factor in digital goods purchases like Apple, Amazon, Facebook, etc., they're definitely seeing those numbers plus probably even a little bit more growth in disputes.
Okay, and one more question just came in, and then we'll move on. Is what will happen with the recent Visa Reason Code 75 cardholder does not recognize? Is that more allocation or collaboration?
Great question. So you are absolutely correct, and thanks for that question. Cardholder not recognized is a dispute chargeback reason code today that is being retired or sunset. Okay, and so here's why. There's a variety of reasons why, and we also have a response in the form of a product that can help support this. So from a issuer and cardholder perspective, and really from a Visa perspective, shifting the liability for a transaction by which if the acquirer and merchant doesn't respond, they are automatically held liable, is not a very fair way when the issuer and the cardholder simply don't recognize a transaction, right? So it was kind of an out for the issuers to just submit their disputes because it required and put a lot of scrutiny on the acquirer and merchant community to respond to these, right? Because you, as a merchant, would get a dispute that says that the cardholder doesn't recognize the transaction. You would have to dig through, provide the fact that maybe the cardholder sat in seat 32B on a 737 plane or whatever it was, headed to Denver. And if you didn't do that, you were held liable, right? And Visa didn't think that that was a fair assessment because that cardholder didn't say it's fraud. They said that they didn't recognize the transaction. So we decided to get rid of or sunset that dispute category. Now, there are implications of doing this. Well, hopefully it translates to less volume by which you have to deal with, but more importantly, the issuer now has to put that dispute in one of the 4 categories that we just talked about. So fraud, authorization, consumer, or processing. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, yeah, it's going to go to fraud. And that's probably right. But there are implications of a issuer putting a transaction into the fraud category. For example, they have to close that account. They have to reissue the plastic. So it really kind of puts some pressure, if you will, on the issuers to make that decision on, okay, if the cardholder says they don't recognize it, you have to pursue fraud. And if you do, you have to close the account. The cardholder is going to have to memorize a new 16-digit number. And so all of that kind of was part of the decision-making process, and sorry for the long-winded answer. But there's one other piece to this puzzle. We have a product in place called Visa Merchant Purchase Inquiry, VMPI. This is a product that is generating an enormous amount of interest for merchants and issuers alike. What is it? It basically allows a pre-dispute exchange of information from the merchant to the issuer. So think about it this way. An issuer gets a call from their cardholder, and by the way, I'm going to cover this on a slide, but I'll just give you some context. The issuer gets a call from the cardholder. The cardholder says, hey, I don't recognize this transaction from Airline X. In today's world, they would just send a dispute in and you'd be responsible and have to pay the fees to your acquirer to respond to that chargeback. With VMPI, Visa Merchant Purchase Inquiry, if you, the merchant, participate in this product, we would send a real-time API request to you right as that issuer identifies that transaction to potentially dispute. You would then have the ability to respond with data elements that you think are pertinent for that cardholder to recognize the transaction. So like, same data elements I just mentioned, maybe the seat number, maybe the flight number, maybe where the origin and destination airports. You could provide that information real time. That issuer would be able to see that data and use that data with their cardholder to say, well, cardholder, this transaction you're looking at pursuing a dispute on for airline X, it looks like the manifold says that Mark Woelfer was the passenger. You sat in seat 32A on a flight from, Orange County, California to Denver. And the hope there is that cardholder says, oh, shoot, that was me. Or maybe perhaps, oh, that was my husband who took a business trip and, thought he expensed it on his corporate card and somehow made it to his personal card. We hope that information or that data sharing would really disable the issuer from having any reason to say that transaction is not recognized, right? Because if you can provide the data pre-dispute, that issuer and cardholder have a decision to make, right? They can't say it's not recognized. It's either it's fraud or it's not a dispute at all. So sorry, Crystal, that was kind of a long answer, but I think it's just very important to understand not only why things have happened, but also a little background as to some of the reasons for why Visa decided to go in a particular direction.
Okay.
Any other questions before we continue?
We do have two. So with the changes in the reason codes, will the required documents be for remedy change as well?
Yeah, so I think I have a slide on that, but just in case I don't, from an acquirer and merchant perspective, you're going to have the same level of visibility into the details of this dispute as you do today. So make no mistake, when I say we're consolidating our 22 chargeback reason codes into these 4 categories, we're doing that on the issuing side, really. On the acquiring and merchant side, you will have the same level of detail you have today. So it will, for example, not just tell you it's an authorization dispute, it'll say it's no authorization. Or a consumer dispute, it might be a quality issue versus just a consumer dispute. So the reason codes RC81, RC83 are being retired and replaced with a new methodology, 10.1, 10.2, 10.3, but you're still going to have the same visibility. Last question, Crystal, and then we can continue.
Yes, one last question. Are there additional costs to implement VMPI?
No, there's not. So from a merchant direct to Visa interaction, there is no cost associated with it. Also, another benefit, we have the capability to provide alerts to you as well. As a participant of VMPI and the fact that you're sharing data pre-dispute, we would also provide you on confirmed events like a fraud event or a confirmed consumer dispute. So really a great setup for our merchants to have pre-dispute resolution, but also visibility into what happens to those transactions. If they go fraud, you probably don't want that customer buying another ticket on a business class international flight, for example. So having an alert to let you know that that transaction turned fraud, you can suspend the account. You can do a whole host of proactive things that will really benefit you as a business.
Okay. So why don't we move on now and we'll answer more questions as we go.
All right. So there are lots of things that VCR is doing to benefit merchants, but I kind of broke it down by way of the dispute lifecycle. So there are things that we're doing in the pre-dispute area, including VMPI, which I just touched on, but we'll elaborate on. We're doing stuff in the actual submission of the dispute, which we've already kind of covered, which is that edits that we're putting in place. And then after the dispute is in flight, we have something as well called response certification. Outside of the process, we're not just improving how a dispute goes from start to finish. We are introducing comprehensive monitoring called our indexing concept for all parties in the ecosystem. So those issuers that are abusing the platform today are we have a scoring system by which we will be able to identify and proactively correct those issues. We're also making some rule changes, not necessarily applicable to the airline industry specifically, but I will cover a slide on that as well. Let's have a look at each of these individually, starting with Visa Merchant Purchase Inquiry. So I've kind of touched on this already, but Visa merchant purchase inquiry originated out of the fact that we at Visa have seen an enormous rise in digital goods disputes, right? So, customer stays up late, maybe had a little too much to drink, spends $150 on Candy Crush at 2 in the morning, wakes up and then calls their issuer and says that it wasn't them that was responsible for that purchase. And so in today's world, we didn't really have a good way, in particular if that wasn't $150, but if it was $10, we didn't really have a good way to facilitate this exchange, right? Issuers have dollar thresholds by which they decide if they're going to pursue a dispute or not. If that dispute is submitted, the merchant's in a difficult spot because it may cost them more money to respond to a dispute through the representment process than it would to simply just write it off. And so we had a problem, and the problem was there was no good way to handle these low dollar, high volume transactions. So we built this Visa merchant purchase inquiry, which, like I said, is a way for the merchants to share data pre-dispute to allow the issuer to attempt to talk that transaction off. So address things like buyer's remorse, like I said, the drunk person playing Candy Crush and then feeling bad that they spent $200 doing it, to confirming that a person was in fact on a flight or made a purchase of a snack box on a flight, for example, which may have showed up separately or combined with the airline fare, depending upon how you have it structured. So it began with us just looking at digital goods, but we realized that this product expands far beyond just the use case of digital goods merchants. So things like travel and entertainment. Did you stay at the hotel? What did you buy at the hotel? Did you fly on this flight? If a cardholder took a flight and you have the details and you could share that information, it is likely that that information, if it is in fact a legitimate purchase, would help to stifle that dispute. So long story short, VMPI is kind of a proactive representment, if you will. It allows you, the merchant, to share data to the issuer, who could then use that data with the cardholder, because the issuer doesn't want to send a dispute either, right? Because their costs are very high, somewhere to the tune of $25 to $60 per dispute. So the next slide, slide number 6, kind of covers how this thing works, right? And it's very, very easy. If we're gonna, a transaction goes through VisaNet just like it normally does. The cardholder is reviewing their statement and they see a purchase that they don't recognize or they think is fraud, and so they pick up the phone and contact their issuer. So that's, we're now working from the upper right back left on the slide. So, step 1, cardholder questions transaction. Step 2, they pick up the phone, contact their issuer. That issuer would find the transaction in our platform called Visa Resolve Online. If the merchant is participating in VMPI, we would send a real-time API request to you guys. You would have in upwards of 200 data elements to share back, including all of the airline data elements you could imagine. And you could then respond in step 4 real time, and we would then share that information with the issuer, who could then share it with the cardholder. So like I said, things like, what email address did you use on the airline mobile app? What flight did you take? Have you taken flights before on this airline? Do you have a frequent flyer number that's also available? All things that you think would be helpful to share. The data that you would normally send in a representative, you could send real time, free of charge, directly to Visa, which we would then share with the issuer. Okay, so slide number 7 here, I'll skip it, but the highlights of slide number 7 is just the interaction between the issuer customer service rep and the cardholder. So this is just providing an example by which Charlene Smith saw a $15 transaction on her statement. She didn't know what it was. Turns out it was her son who was playing Candy Crush. He spent $15 and the mom let him do that because he got straight A's on his report card. So it was simply an issue of recognition. She hangs up the phone. No dispute is ever raised. That doesn't impact your chargeback rates. You don't have to pay your acquirer to respond to a chargeback, just a whole host of benefits for VMPI. I think there's one more slide, and then we'll stop and see if there's any more questions, Crystal. But like I alluded to, as of April of 2017, so last year, we introduced this capability to provide alerts real time. So merchants that participate and you share transaction data, that cardholder says it absolutely wasn't me, this is fraud, we would send you a real-time notification to let you know that that is a confirmed fraud event. We do have a fraud report for that transaction, but more importantly, it allows you to react very quickly, right? So if you want to close that account, if you want to contact the cardholder, whatever you want to do, you have the capability to do so, because we're going to tell you as soon as we become available, or the information becomes available to Visa, we will tell you that there's a confirmed fraud event, dispute, submission, exception file, or stop payment. Okay, Crystal, let's see if there's any other questions on VMPI.
All right, we got several that have come in. So, number one, how do we provide real-time documentation with Visa enrolled in the new VMPI product?
Sure. So documentation isn't necessarily the word, and I know that you guys and we talk about documentation in the form of, typically an attachment that goes along with the dispute. VMPI is kind of next generation. It is our systems talking to your systems, right? So we would send you data from VisaNet that would help you quickly identify that transaction. You would have, it wouldn't be a person sitting there waiting for these. It would be our systems talking to yours. And so that's what API technology is, if you're not familiar. But it's a very simple request and response through a very secure, encrypted fashion. So we would send you data that you could tap into your transactional flight manifest databases and pull back or retrieve information that you deem is useful to share with the issuer. So it's certainly real time. It has to be, right? The issuer can't be sitting waiting for 3 minutes or 5 minutes for you to respond. It would be our computers talking to your computers.
Okay. Are there any changes in time frame in raising a dispute? So basically, within how many days the cardholder can raise a dispute now with the new Visa rules?
No, because, and we did look at that originally, but the reality is we have to afford that cardholder the capability to identify a potential issue, right? And so for that, it is, I believe, 75 days for authorization disputes and 120 days for fraud, consumer, and processing errors. So we looked at it. It didn't make a lot of sense because it's not necessarily the cardholder's fault for the fact that, things show up on their statement. We need to afford them some time to identify a potential issue as fraud or otherwise. So that timeline has not changed, but when we get through a couple of additional slides, the time frames that the issuers have to respond to your disputes certainly have changed.
Okay. With VMPI, do they alert the merchant or the acquirer?
It would most likely be the merchant, rather. So this would be communication directly from the merchant to Visa, right? And we know that this is not how the typical flow works, right? So having this communication protocol would alert you directly. And the benefit of that is you will get notified earlier, right? A fraud dispute today goes to your acquirer. They sometimes do some research on it, and then they send it to you guys. And that may be days before you figure out that there's a confirmed fraud event. And oh, by the way, that cardholder may, like I said, be booking an international trip that you don't know about because you haven't formally received anything yet. And that could further the damages. So having this protocol by which we can send data directly to you gets the data to you quicker.
And is the acquirer involved at all in the process?
They can be, they don't have to be. Typically, and by the way, this is no secret to acquirers. We have told all of them about Visa Merchant Purchase Inquiry, and Visa's position is as follows. We will communicate with this API to anybody that's willing to share the data with us, right? If the acquirer has access to the detailed transaction data, then so be it. We will ping them and they can provide the merchant details. What we found, though, is that most acquirers don't have that level of detail. And most acquirers rather say, go directly to our merchants because they're the ones with the information. And so that's typically how this ends up getting structured. So Visa doesn't care. We would integrate with anybody, but it usually ends up being the merchant by way of them having their detailed data readily available.
And so what is a typical length of time that a merchant will have to respond to an inquiry?
2 seconds. And like I said, that is because our systems are talking to yours. All of this is automated. All of this takes place through API technology. I imagine most of your companies have the capability to incorporate APIs if they are not doing it already. So it's a very, very short time frame. But then again, every merchant that we've ever participated with this in has the capability to do so in the 2-second time frame.
Okay. So how can a merchant implement VMPI?
Sure, there's a couple ways. If you're interested, contact your Visa support rep. They will get you in touch with me. There's also a bit more automated way to do it through our Visa developer portal, VDP, where you can go in and do some self-service and sandbox testing. But for now, contact your Visa support rep, or even just contact Crystal and she can let me know. And then we will have some conversations and I can take you through how this thing works specifically.
Okay. And will VMPI be implemented across the board or is it in certain regions?
Globally used. So you as a merchant, if you participate in VMPI, any dispute across the globe that is a Visa transaction, you will have the capability to respond with this VMPI data. And more importantly, you will also get the alerts across the globe. So if we get a fraud notification, you get a fraud notification.
Okay, and we'll answer just a few more and then we'll continue on with the presentation. What if a merchant doesn't respond to VMPI? At what point will it become a financial dispute? Will there be an indicator on the dispute that there was a previous VMPI interaction?
Great question. So we will continue as normal if say we sent you a VMPI request and you didn't fulfill it in the 2 seconds, or something happened and there was an error on your end. It'll just be a normal transaction and a normal dispute from an issuer perspective. They will have no visibility that something went wrong. They will have the ability to pursue a dispute just like they do today. So it will become financial when they decide that they are formally going to submit a dispute on this and pursue that route.
And then one more question and we'll move forward. On the case of friendly fraud, how does the chargeback procedure start and can it be disputed? Yeah, so friendly fraud, it's a big deal, right? And VMPI is designed to try and stifle that, right? Because the issue we have is the issuer doesn't have enough data, right? So when the cardholder says, hey, I have an $8 transaction from Airline X and it looks like, I don't know what this is, the issuer is like, I don't know what this is either. So I'll submit a dispute on your behalf and we'll figure that out. But with VMPI, you can share data before that issuer even pursues a dispute, right? So when that issuer finds that transaction in our platform, you participate in VMPI, you could share data immediately. And that data could be that issuer, that $8 transaction was a purchase of our snack box, our healthy snack box, which was purchased by Mark Woelfer sitting in seat 32B on a flight from Denver to Chicago. And so when the issuer is equipped with that data, they then become almost a customer service representative for you, because they are going to merely pass the information along, but that's going to make that cardholder second guess. And we hope that it's simply they didn't know what the $8 was, and they realize it's a snack box now, and then they hang up the phone. But those guys that are still trying to not pay the $8, they're going to be a lot more skeptical when the issuer tells them all the data that they have about that purchase, right? If I'm a cardholder and I'm trying to fudge the system and it says, well, Mark, you were on a flight from Denver to Chicago in 32B and you purchased a snack box, and I was on a flight from Denver to Chicago in 32B,
I'm going to be a lot more reluctant to try and lie and try and pursue that dispute, right? So there's a lot of just data sharing, and we hope people are honest, but there's also a lot of psychology involved in this, right? It's that cardholder is going to have to really think about pursuing this dispute with all the data that was just shared, right? And the issuer will be empowered with all that data that you provided to talk that transaction off.
Thank you, Mark. We do have a couple more questions in queue, but I say, why don't we go ahead and go through some more of the presentation, and then we'll ask them at that time.
Sounds great. Yeah, I'm hitting these slides pretty quick, so I know I'm glad there's a lot of questions. We'll try and do our best to get those answered as quickly as possible. Okay, so this was the slide that I was hoping was in here, which it was, which is to say that I mentioned that we are consolidating our 22 chargeback reason codes into 4 dispute categories. Really, that is almost a moot point from a merchant perspective, because what we're trying to do is reduce the possibility for errors on the issuing side, right? If the issuer has to pick one of these 22, the likelihood of them getting it wrong is high. If they just have to pick one of the 4, and in certain cases we can derive what the condition is, then that situation is less prone for errors. So particularly in fraud or authorization, the issuer, all they have to do is pick the category, and we will be able to derive the condition. You on the acquiring merchant side will still get access to all these detailed descriptors. Like I said, the RC81, RC83 reason codes will change, but the numbering pattern here will be used and the same detail will be provided. So I think the question, and hopefully I'll get more clear here with the answer that was asked a couple minutes ago, is yeah, your acquirer reports may change because they won't say RC83 anymore, but the details will still be available. The numbering scheme may change a little bit. Okay, so associated transactions is the next concept we have in the pre-dispute area. This is another really, really good benefit that we're doing for merchants. And what it is that we are going to scrutinize VisaNet. We meaning the VROL dispute platform, are going to scrutinize VisaNet for any credits, reversals, or adjustments that may apply to the original dispute. So we do this a little bit today, but it's certainly not comprehensive and it's certainly not global. So for example, if the cardholder contacted you guys and got a refund and then contacts the issuer and says, hey, issuer, I needed to get my money back and I didn't, if we found an existing credit reversal or adjustment, we will do one of 2 things. If we find an exact match, we are going to block that issuer from proceeding. We will say, issuer, you already have credit for this transaction, your cardholder is whole, there's nothing to do here. But if we don't have an exact match and we have what's called a fuzzy match, we may ask that issuer identify if this transaction is associated or not. And so we will say, we will present to them the transaction details, and then they will be required to tell us if the transaction is associated or not. And again, this is to prevent a dispute being submitted that you the merchant, has already credited, right? Because that's a waste of time. So associated transactions is designed to target that specific issue. Okay, next slide. We covered this already, chargeback rights identification. We are putting comprehensive edits in place to block disputes that are invalid on the issuing side. So this is an example of a chip card transaction. It's quite simply, based on the rules, the issuer is liable. You as the acquirer and merchant will never see that dispute because we will block it before it gets to you. There's a whole host of other edits in place, including things for authorization that I mentioned earlier. So this is great news for merchants. We are going to do our best to reduce the amount of volume you get for disputes that aren't disputes. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide here because there's a lot of information and I want to make sure you're crystal clear on all of it. First things first, I mentioned the fact that we have these 2 processes called allocation and collaboration. You do not need to know the details of that, but just know that allocation means that that's a fraud and authorization dispute. Collaboration means that it's a consumer and processing dispute. First off, when I say response certification, what I mean is that all parties, acquirers and merchants and issuers, have to respond to a given cycle of the dispute process. So what I mean is that when an issuer sends a dispute to you guys, you have to respond. If you don't respond, you're held liable. On the flip side, if you respond to a dispute, the issuer also has to respond. And if they don't, then they are held liable, right? So each of these flows at the bottom right, it says the star says hard time frames. That means that if you don't do that activity within the time frame allotted, then you are accepting the liability for that transaction. Okay, so the second piece of this is the time frames have been equalized. They have been reduced, that's one thing, but they've also been equalized. So if we look at allocation, you'll see that the issuer sends a dispute and the acquirer and merchant have 30 calendar days to review and respond to that dispute. This used to be a financial representment. Now it's a non-financial pre-arbitration. The acquirers have 30 days to review and respond to that transaction. That, of course, means that they will likely provide to you a subset of that 30 days to do what you need to do to respond to them. A pre-arbitration that is valid is sent over to the issuer. The issuer has 30 days to review and respond to that. They can accept it or they can decline it. And then the merchant acquirer have 10 days to file arbitration. Arbitration is a fee-based service by which Visa's Global Arbitration and Compliance Group makes a final liability assignment. Okay, so if you're looking at this flow from start to finish, it is 70 calendar days, down from 105 to 150 days today. So we spend a lot of time here. We spend a lot of time focusing on what activities are required, how we can equalize the time frames, but more importantly, make sure that there's enough time, but we do shrink it a bit to make it a bit more manageable to get disputes resolved quicker. On the collaboration side, this flow is very similar to how it works today. A dispute and dispute response are similar to a chargeback and representment today, although there's 30 days versus the 45 days that's provided today. The issuer then initiates a pre-arbitration. Now, in a dispute response, that is a shift in liability back to the issuer, just like it is today. And if the issuer pursues pre-arbitration, the issuer holds the liability. And so pre-arbitrations are non-financial. They have 30 days. Acquirer, you would review and respond to that through a pre-arb response. And then the issuer has 10 calendar days to file arbitration. So collaboration, we didn't do a lot as far as the total time frame. It was 105 days today. It's 100 days with this process, but we did equalize how long each party has to review and respond. Okay. Let's just make our way to the end of the presentation, and then let's just answer a flood of disputes. Of questions there. Okay, indices. So this is a very, very important concept. It has become foundational to how we are implementing VCR. Indices means that every party in the ecosystem is going to have a health score. A health score is exactly like your personal credit score. So if you, as a individual, take out credit or use credit, you pay your mortgage on time, then your score is going to be fine, right? And it's going to increase. If you take out a bunch of credit cards and you make a late payment on a bunch of those, then your score is going to dip. It is the same concept for the dispute process. If the issuer is doing what they should be doing, their score will be fine and nothing will happen. If their issuer is doing things to manipulate the platform and they're changing reason codes to submit disputes to try and get it through the process, their score will begin to dip. Once it hits a threshold, we will contact that issuer and tell them that they need, they need to make corrections to a particular issue. Same goes for the merchant and acquirers, though, right? If you're, for example, sending compelling evidence with a blank document attachment, that's not abiding by the rules aligned with the Visa dispute process. So indexing is an important concept by which Visa is going to get a lot better visibility into our clients that are using the system well, but also manipulating the system in certain instances. Okay, a couple more slides here. Rule changes. Doubt this is going to be applicable to you guys, but we did make some rule changes. Generally speaking, if you're liable for the transaction today, you're going to be liable with VCR. We're not making any sweeping changes to that. But we did make a couple rules that are designed to assist merchants. This first one is around just assigning a maximum of disputes by volume. So this is a digital goods type of a rule change. I doubt you've seen fraud to the tune of more than 35 transactions, given being in the airline industry. I imagine it's possible, but probably not likely. But for our digital goods guys, the Googles, Apple, Amazon, etc., they might get hundreds of disputes today. And so we want to make sure that the issuers have the correct and appropriate fraud procedures in place. So we're going to limit their volume of disputes to 35 transactions within a 120-day period. The next one here is around issuers have come to Visa and said, sometimes we get isolated fraud, Visa, and the cardholder has all their recurring billing, and we don't want to close the account and reinitiate the plastic. And so we said, okay, but if you don't close the account and reinitiate the plastic, then you're going to be held liable for any future fraud on that account. The merchant will not be liable. We will simply block you from ever submitting a fraud dispute on that card again. And so what that means is that the issuers are going to close the account and reinitiate the plastic. So it's kind of much ado about nothing, but we did relax the rule, but we're preventing any future fraud from getting to you guys, so it's a non-issue from your perspective. Okay, so those are all the things, obviously there's probably more, but those are some of the key things that Visa is doing to help merchants with the dispute process by the tune of the VCR changes. The go live date is the weekend of April 15th. So we are about 3.5, 4 weeks away. We've done a lot of training for the past 3 years. We're allowing our issuers and acquirers and processors basically full access to the Visa product office and rules folks to get their questions answered. We are moving forward with the April 15th timeline. It's coming in a couple weeks. And obviously our soft launch went live October of 2017. It was a really big success. They're seeing vast improvements in time frame reduction. We are blocking, I think, 8 to 11% of disputes, so a little bit lower than our 14% that we anticipate across the globe, but still very, very high numbers. The average dispute time frame is about 16 to, I think, 25 days, down from 46. So a lot of good stats coming out of the soft launch, and we're really, really excited about it. Okay, so Crystal, I do have one last slide to kind of summarize things, but why don't we take a bunch of questions here, and then I'll finish off with that last slide at the end, summarizing today's conversation.
Sure. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So in the case of fraud, if the cardholder raises any dispute after the time limit, will that's requested be invalid by Visa, or the merchant will receive any notification that that request has now been invalid?
So you mean like after the 120 days,
Mm-hmm.
the issuer would, the issuer would simply be blocked. The acquirer and merchant would not be made aware of the actual dispute because we wouldn't have one, right? I'm thinking that if the issuer does pursue a fraud report and you are a participant in VMPI, we would send you that alert notification. So you would have access to it, even though you'd never see a dispute on it. You may still want to close the account because that's a confirmed fraud event.
Okay. So how long are they required to have data stored in order to support VMPI?
It's a great question. So our contract says a year now, but that is negotiable, right? I think 3 to 6 months at least, probably 6 months would be manageable, because obviously the purpose of having that data stored is that when we ping you, we want to be able to respond to the issuer with actual data, right? If you're storing data for only a week or two, then obviously any dispute after that amount would come back with a null response. So the contract says 12 months. If that was an issue, we would certainly be willing to work with you on just understanding what you have and you know, incorporating that to the best of our ability.
Okay. Will there be any charge if a merchant requests for more information about a dispute?
Kind of depends on what you're talking about. So if you're talking about through your acquirer, then it's kind of up to them as far as how they want to price that out. For VMPI, if you're not, you wouldn't request more information, but we would send you more information by way of an alert. That is obviously no charge associated with that.
Okay. In this world, how does card present work, since there is a limited data available?
Yeah, so generally speaking, there are, you know, I have to be a bit generic here, but card present disputes, if we confirm that the dispute is card present, then it's issuer liable submission. So if an issuer tries, in other words, if an issuer tries to pursue a card present dispute, just like this transaction here on slide 11, we would simply block them.
Okay. Does Visa have any plans to provide the cardholder name on the chargeback to allow us to determine if the cardholder was on the plane, therefore reducing the amount of work that's needed to provide the flight manifest information for all fraud chargebacks?
Good question. I think it is part of the questionnaire, but it is optional. So I don't think Visa has any near-term plans to mandate the use of the cardholder name. It is available for the issuer to submit. I presume by way of your question, it's probably not coming through all that often, but it is an option for the issuer to provide.
Okay. For associated transactions, how do you know if the transactions are associated? Is this by the ticket number or something else?
Great question. So it's a lot of VisaNet data elements, right? So the primary account number, the amount of the transaction, the merchant, the auth code, the TRAN ID, the transaction ID, that's a Visa unique field. If that matches, that is almost a guarantee that that transaction is associated. It is a guarantee that that transaction is associated. So those are the types of fields that we use, the fields that are flowing through VisaNet. There's others, but those are some of the main ones.
Okay. Disputes usually have a charge involved. Does this query also have a charge as well? I'm not quite sure. I'm actually going to ask for more information on that question, so sure, we can go for that. In an allocation, if there is a fee to submit pre-arbitration and then withdraw after receiving the pre-arbitration response from the issuer.
Okay, let me make sure I digested that correctly. I'm going to try and answer your question. If you need a follow-up, let me know. So you can, issuers and acquirers can recall a response that they have performed within 72 hours, so long as the opposing side has not yet responded. Okay, so if you send something, you're like, oh shoot, I did something wrong, you can pull that back, or your acquirer can pull that back as long as it's within 72 hours. There is an exception to that for cardholder no longer wishes to dispute. So this is primarily an issuing side, but if the issuer sends a dispute and then 6 days later, the cardholder says, shoot, I actually do know what this is. I'm sorry, I didn't realize what this was. As long as the acquirer and merchant haven't responded, the issuer can pull that back after the 72-hour time frame. But then again, that means that the issuer cannot pursue a dispute on that. So if they pull it back, they are pulling it back. We would then prevent them from proceeding with another dispute category.
Okay. So under the scheme, for those cases under allocation, are those automatically identified as valid frauds? And is there a reason for which an airline will not have to really reply to dispute, but a pre-arbitration?
Yeah, so basically for allocation, what we're doing is we're saying we have enough data to, and our rules are specific enough to tell you who's liable for this transaction, right? But that's just like today, you guys have the capability to send what's called compelling evidence. So like if we say, You know, and this is the world you operate in, right? It's card not present. I purchase a flight online. The cardholder says it's fraud. It's card not present. You guys get a dispute. And so in today's world, what do? You say, well, you know, that cardholder actually did get on that plane, and here's the details that tell you that that cardholder got on the plane. Nothing really changes with that. You still have the capability to send compelling evidence just like you do today. It's just that it's non-financial. We're saying that we're not going to shift the liability back to the issuer because as the rules are written, card not present fraud is liable. The acquirer and merchant are liable. Now, down the line, if Visa identifies certain things that are a remedy, then perhaps that changes. But for now, compelling evidence and your response to say that the cardholder was on the flight is available in fraud disputes just like it is today.
Okay. And so for arbitration cases, the fees will remain the same?
Oh, good question. Okay, so arbitration, in today's world, we have two fees. The fee is $250 to file and $250 to actually get a response, okay? What we found is that both sides use it as a crux to try and threaten the opposing side. So in other words, I'm going to spend the $250 to file against you in hopes that you just back off. We don't want that to happen. So what we did is we consolidated the two fees into a single fee. So arbitration is $500. There's no increase, right? It's the same dollar amount. It's just two fees that were consolidated into one. And you do have the right to pull that back, you know, or to recall that. That's the word I'm looking for. Recall that arbitration, but you're still going to pay the fee, right? So we just made it very simple, and we want to avoid the manipulation and the threatening aspect that our pricing supports today.
Okay. Another question. So on one of the slides, it showed client testing was beginning in May 2017. They just want to make sure it's 2018, correct?
This is right here. This is when your acquirers started actually sending transactions for VCR in our test environment. So what this means is that, you know, if you use First Data as a processor or TSYS, they started testing, you know, we're basically just trying to show you that there's been a year that's been going on that our clients have been sending transaction information, VCR transactions into our test environment. Sorry for the confusion.
Okay. If the merchant does not participate in VMPI, do they still automatically receive a chargeback?
Yep. If you don't participate, it's going to work like it does today. You'll just get a chargeback that does impact your chargeback rates. You will have to pay your acquirer to respond to those chargebacks. So VMPI is definitely something you might want to look at just by way of the cost and by way of all the other benefits, including reduction in costs and chargeback rates.
Okay. Will VMPI help in cases where a passenger calls into their call center but the card is not present? So will they be able to help with those type of situations?
Yeah, I think so, because like I was mentioning with my example before, if you have detailed data for that transaction and that issuer sees it come back through the dispute platform and passes it along to the cardholder, then that could help, right? I mean, in theory, if that cardholder still wants to pursue a card not present dispute, they have every right to do so. And as the rules are written, it's not in your favor from a merchant perspective, but passing the data pre-dispute, that, you know, there are honest cardholders that simply don't know what the purchase is. And like I said, the second piece is for those that are in fact trying to manipulate the system and they're fraudsters, having more data that the issuer has readily available will definitely introduce some psychology to this whole process, where the cardholder says, well, shoot, if they know that I flew from Denver to Chicago and I was on seat 32B, this is probably not a transaction I should be attempting to get my money back on, because they have a lot of information that says I was actually on the flight, right? So there's a lot So long story short, there's a ridiculous amount of benefit for sharing VMPI data, even if the transaction was card not present.
Okay. Can you confirm that the merchant ID will not be a factor when it comes to matching refunds? So in the case for airlines, they rarely use the same merchant ID for a sale and a refund.
That's a very good question. I mean, we don't disclose the full details of the algorithm, but I should be able to answer this question. I don't know if the MID is actually used as part of our algorithm. I know the fields like primary account number, auth code, tran ID, date, amount, those fields are, but I would assume that the answer is yes, because it is an identifier field. Now, is it a high priority one like a tran ID? Probably not, but it probably is factored in.
Okay. Will a merchant receive a fraud notification on a 3D secure transaction?
In the form of an alert, if that is a confirmed fraud event that we blocked by way of 3D secure, then yes. If we got a fraud report, you get a fraud report. Not a fraud dispute. Don't mix the two. A fraud report is just a notification that issuer has confirmed fraud on a particular primary account number, and we would pass that along to you.
Okay. In the new process, if a cardholder receives double credits from a refund and a dispute, are the good faith requests actioned?
That's right. That's right. So associated transactions is going to block, 90 to 95 or whatever it is, a high percentage of these transactions by which a credit was already initiated. But there's always the chance that the merchant and the acquirer are sending a credit at the same time that the issuer is initiating a dispute, and then a double instance takes place. So that is where you can obviously respond to the dispute or go down the good faith route as well.
Okay. Are there any financial implications as a result of poor scores related to the established indices?
No. So, and I was going to say not yet, because if you have a bad index score, what we're doing is it's just right now, it's strictly us identifying and being able to correct issues, right? We want to have a lot more visibility into the platform that we do today. So there's no financial impact or penalty. It would merely be, hey, issuer, you're changing the dispute category for 40% of the transactions. You need to stop doing that, right? But down the line, like if it's certainly plausible that if the issuer is constantly manipulating the system and they're not making corrections to obey the rules, Visa starts to tack away at the liability assignment and says, okay, issuer, you're clearly manipulating the platform. Maybe when you win a dispute, you only get 75% of the transaction amount versus the 100. So I'm just like future stating. This is something that's not in the near term, but it's something that we'll probably look at because the index concept provides a foundation for us to look at those types of things. It's also, the indexing itself may help correct the issues by which no penalty or no issues around split liability assignment is ever required. So it's really kind of a data capture exercise for Visa right now to see what we want to do next.
Okay. Can you provide a little further clarification on the API technology for accessing data elements within that merchant as it relates to PII for sensitive data? So, for example, if there's a charge in question, will it be able to provide the name of the people purchasing any ancillary fees?
Yeah, so the way I would answer this is VMPI data is basically the exact data that you send in a representment today. So do you send the name in a representment today because you think it's useful to respond? Then you can certainly send the name in the VMPI request. So it's quite simply a representment that is done through a different channel, right? So all the data elements that you send today are fair game to send and more, in theory, with the VMPI API facilitation.
what happens if the merchant is VMPI but the issuer is not? Is there a liability shift?
No. Maybe down the line that would be the case, like, because obviously VMPI could help facilitate certain remedies, right? And Airline is actually a very good example. Like, if you have a confirmed flight manifest of a cardholder that took a flight segment, in theory, and oh, by the way, had to use their ID with a government-paid official TSA to get to on that flight, then that's reasonable assurance that that person was on that flight, right? And so, in theory, if you responded with those types of data elements in the future, Visa could have a bit more stringent rules upon what the issuer can do next, right? Maybe in the form of actually blocking that dispute from ever taking place. So, so that is a potential down the line future enhancement that Visa is looking at.
Okay. And one last question, and again, everyone, if you have more questions, please feel free to submit them. Is VMPI replacing the retrieval process?
Great question. So that's a very, very intuitive thing you thought there, because in theory the answer is yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not in the form of we are not getting rid of the copy request process yet, but why have a copy request process if you have a better way to share data real time versus, you know, a paper-based copy request process? So, you know, in theory, and I've heard rumblings about October 2018, perhaps the copy request process is going to be sunset, because VMPI is just quite simply a better mousetrap. It's just a better way to share data. It's done real time. It's free of charge. There's just too many benefits to allow a paper-based process to continue.
Okay. We've actually received a couple more questions that just came in. In allocation, what is the fee to submit the pre-arbitration?
You have to ask your acquirer, right? We have fees associated that we charge them, and of course they may pass that fee along to you. They may charge you more, they may charge you less. So we can't really comment on the specifics because our pricing is to the acquirer, not to the merchant.
Okay. Is there
I will say this. Yeah, and Crystal, sorry, I just because that's very vague. There's a couple things that play with the pricing. There are going to be pricing tiers depending upon how quickly you respond. There are going to be pricing tiers that are cheaper and substantially cheaper than what is charged today. If you use the majority of the time, that's where the price starts to get a little bit more than what is charged today. So work with your acquirer; they'll have all the details. We're pricing this to incent both merchant acquirers and issuers to respond quicker, right? That's one of the key benefits. The pricing supports that.
Okay. Is there a mandate for issuers in order to implement this technology?
No, there isn't, but I'll tell you this. 7 of the top 10 issuers in the United States have asked about and inquired about Visa Merchant Purchase Inquiry. The benefits are there, guys. The issuers want to use the data, right? If they have it, they would much rather have that cardholder hang up the phone and not submit a dispute versus the issuers incurring the $25 to $60 or even writing off the transaction because it was an $8 a snack box purchase. So the issuers have all the incentive in the world to use the transaction data. We don't need to mandate it because they want to use it.
Okay, and then one last question. If the merchant offered 3D Secure, but the cardholder did not use it and later there was a fraud, who is the responsible party for that fraud?
I knew we were going to get to a question that I don't have the answer to. These very specific instances around rules, I don't have the answer, guys. I'm the product guy. We have a rules team. If you want, you can send that request to Crystal and get it to me, and I can see if our rules folks can get it or get you some answers. I just don't have the ability to answer that specific question.
Okay. Well, those are all the questions that have been submitted. We did receive a couple of questions in regards to the presentation and the recording, and yes, we are recording this webinar today, and it will be sent out to all registrants. So you will receive a copy of the recording.
Okay, Crystal, so let me quickly just cover this last slide here. I mean, I think and I'm not going to hit all these bullets, but I think in summary, you can kind of see where Visa's going. And by the way, like, just a great amount of questions. I'm so glad. I felt like I was on the hot seat, but that was very good that you guys had very detailed questions. I'm glad that you guys are understanding, interpreting the changes. I mean, from a VCR perspective, we're really just trying to get disputes resolved quicker, reduce the number of errors, identify proactively when things happen versus being reactive. And so I hope this translates into, cost savings and more efficiencies for you guys so that you can go about the business of selling goods and services and not having to deal with all this dispute volume and all these arduous processes. So that's kind of the summary from my perspective, Crystal. Anything, closing comments on your side?
Actually, we do have, let's see, one more question is, where can they find the new remedy rules online for the new chargeback reason codes?
There is what we're calling an enhanced copy of the dispute resolution rules. You'll need to request that through your acquirer. We don't post that until the actual release date, which is the April 15th. So we have what we call an advanced copy. Your acquirers have it; they can get it to you. It summarizes the changes from a dispute perspective for the rules.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark. And again, thank you for taking out your time today and going through this in detail. Thank you all for all the questions that you submitted. Again, we did record this webinar and it will be posted. We are also sending out the presentation. And if you have additional questions, you may go back, listen to the webinar again and think, oh, I should have asked this. Please feel free to just submit those to me. You'll have my contact information and we'll make sure that we send it to the appropriate parties. And so, Mark, anything else from you?
No, thank you guys so very, very much for your time and your great questions. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you all and have a wonderful day. Take care.